We should say first that the definition itself, as an academic definition of the combination of photography and journalism, called photojournalism, was a term coined only in 1924 by historian and the dean of the University of Missouri School of Journalism, Frank Luther Mott. So it's a kind of maybe also a retroactive vision of the photojournalism if it starts in the middle of the 19th century. He thought mostly about the profession that was at the beginning of its golden age in Europe and then also in the States while inventing this definition, this term. As it is done generally with media history, we should distinguish, I think, between history of the press and history of the journalists, history of news and history of newsmen, history of media and history of the mediators. So in this context, maybe we can see the 1850s as the apparition of the first photojournalists or photoreporters, and then the 1920s as the beginning of the first photojournals, of the support of the medium itself. But generally, there are some definitions of photojournalism. I try to read you one or two, but there is no really, it's very difficult to find a definition for a photojournalist, as it is very difficult to find a definition for a journalist. You know, the term of journalist, the definition of journalist, mostly European. In the American tradition, there is no such a profession, a journalist. There are reporters, there are writers, editors, photographers, etc., etc. They're not speaking really about journalists. What's important in the American tradition is the medium itself, is the press enterprise, the company, the newspaper, and the journalist should represent a newspaper. So the stringers, of course, are in a very difficult position from this point of view. So we have here also a problem of definition of the photojournalist itself. So my remarks will be mostly about this, maybe some changes and some different concepts in the definition of truth history, in the definition of the photojournalism or the photojournal, the profession itself, and of the photojournalists and the people who are dealing with this profession. If I look on a simple encyclopedic definition of the photojournalism, I see that, for instance, in one encyclopedia, photojournalism is a particular form of journalism, the collecting, editing, and presenting of news material for publication or broadcast, because now we're including sometimes also the broadcast journalists, the cameraman or the broadcast journalists in this framework. It is now usually understood to refer only to still images, but in some cases the term also refers to video and broadcast journalism. And photojournalism is distinguished from other branches of photography and then documentary, street, and celebrity, etc. By which qualities, and the qualities are number of three. Timeliness, I mean the images have a meaning in a context of a recently published record of events. Objectivity, the situation implied by the images is a fair and accurate representation of the events they depict in both content and tone. And finally, the narrative. The narrative, I mean the images should combine with other news elements to make facts relatable to the viewer or reader on a cultural level. So I would say that all the three definitions can be discussed, and they are discussed by many researchers who do not find always all of them in the profession of the journalist as it was developed during the years. And for instance, we shall speak about the time as a context, speaking about the pretensions of journalists to tell their own story only by images, which was the main basis of the new wave of the golden age of the photojournalism, which was, to my, as I think also one, I'm not the only one to think it, one of the reasons of its failure. So the failure was not only the apparition of television, but it was only the pretension to tell a full journalistic story only by images that finally was proved almost impossible. We can also, that will be maybe my point of view, to look at the history of photojournalism as history of its relations with journalism per se, or between journalists and photographers, reporters and photoreporters. And then this pretension or this distinction between photojournalism as a part, a component of the news work, adding the proof or the truth element to the work of the journalist on the field, who is only writing about what he sees, or as a whole, as an alternative way to bring news. And of course, the photojournalism, the photojournals pretended also to have different functions. I mean, more popularization, not to address the well-educated, the well-informed, but also those who, if I read a quotation from Henry Luce, the creator of Time and then of Look magazine in 1923, he says people in America are for the most part poorly informed. People are uninformed because there is no publication. No publication has adapted itself to the time in which busy men are able to spend the time that the busy men are able to spend on simply being informed. So if you were informed by busy men, do it as television did later, in some words with many pictures, etc., etc. This functionalist regard, functionalist look on the profession contributed also to a kind of concept, a new concept of press that the photojournalism wanted to install. Another look that I can give before trying to look at the 2 or 3 periods in which how did they differ conceptually from one another. The best look on this distinction, that's from the field regard, if you like, can be made the distinction that can be made between reporters and photoreporters can be or can come from the position of the adversary. I mean of the PRs, of the press management, of the politicians, those who make the rules during while for the journalists are working. And I'm speaking here about hard news, not about soft news, because we're trying, I think, to preserve the photojournalism as representing the hard news, and not to return to the old days when it was mostly a pictorial journalism of fashion and and soft news. As of course, it's much easier to give violent scenes than to explain and to give some context to the journalistic information. I mean, when we're speaking about press opportunity or about a photo opportunity, is not the same thing. The press today and the politics today, creating images, creating media events, is accused to produce too much photo opportunities and less press opportunities. What is a photo opportunity? When you're on the field, I mean, when you're during meeting, an important political international meeting, the photographs normally are admitted where the journalists themselves are not admitted. They are admitted to make the picture of the beginning of the meeting, of the end of a meeting. So we have the picture. So I don't know, Netanyahu and Livni maybe meeting together and giving a big laugh to the camera. But they're giving it to the camera. We don't know anything about the contents of the meeting, which can be very tough, which is very tough. We have the notion of the family photos in big international conference, and the family photo normally is disinformation. I mean, with such a family meet. So the only moment when they are together is the family photo. During the last Copenhagen conference that I covered last week, the things went so far that this family photo was simply cancelled. It was a too big family, you know, 192 chief of state, that some of them didn't want at all to be even 2 or 3 or 4 meters from each another. But it means that from the definition by, you know, what I call the adversaries, the photojournalism should be a kind of a counter-journalism to show what they want the public to see and not to show what is really the contents, what is really happening. So from this point of view, it's a devaluation of the position of the photo reporter, and the photo reporter is very glad to have this scoop, to go inside while the journalists are outside when the meeting starts. So and he is giving us only the photo, and when he's there, if he's journalist, of course, if he hears something, he can always tell his journalist or another friend, etc., what happens there. But they try not to speak. If they speak, it's a fault, it's a mistake, and we had some incidents like this. So you see, it's a kind of the French say diviser pour régner. I mean, they're just trying to make a split between journalists and reporters and photo reporters, which means that we are dealing with two different professions. As I said, and I will add also another remark concerning the journalistic period. I have how much more? 10 minutes is very good. I finish in 10 minutes. And if we see that we're speaking about those two professions, concurrent professions, we should think also about the definition of the profession at its beginning. At the beginning, if we may say so, especially in the American press, but it was also right for the Jewish press, as we know, you see, the press enterprise, the journal or the functioning of the journalist, of the creator of a newspaper, it was a kind of one-man operation. I mean, the journalist did always did all the functions about his journal. We think about this journalist, you know, you can see in movies, going to the West. So he's writing the articles, he's taking the pictures, he's also publishing his own newspaper. So it's a kind of multi-journalist that is doing all the functions. Of course, it's not in the tradition of the photo reporters as bringing with them the heritage of the artists who were doing the engraving, doing the illustrations for the press. And if I extrapolate to our days, this beginning of the press, I think today in the profession, in the academic profession, I think we are speaking about creating a new type of education, of communication education to journalism. We are speaking about a multi-platform journalist. It's the new term that I think I started to use it in the British schools. So what is finally the multi-platform journalist today that it is working as kind of multimedia journalist? He's supposed to be the reporter. He's supposed to be also the cameraman. He's supposed to take also stills. He's supposed also to take sound. He's supposed to do everything. It's because of course of financial reasons, but it's a kind also, I think, taking us back to the beginnings of the press, where there was no differentiations between the different functions of the press, which means maybe the end of the press, of the end of journalism, as Kouts once said. It's maybe the end of the journalism, even if maybe the future, finally, of journalism, of bringing and giving the full context of the news, and maybe the only means where a photojournalist and the written journalist today, because I think their fates are linked together, can still exist. It's on the internet. It's in this multimedia environment. Because there, of course, we can give written information that will be supported by a still, by a video, by sound, etc., etc. So maybe the beginning is the end, or the beginning is a kind of a new beginning. Going back to the historical framework. I think that we should see the sources of the photojournalism not in the written journalism itself, in the reporter journalism, but mostly in what was called the pictorial journalism, the pictorial press. I mean the press giving to pictures preference over text. And as such, we can see already in 1842, when before the photography, a journal like the Illustrated London News as the first pictorial press journal, giving pictures preference over text. I mean, more pictures, less text. And in the 1890s, the first magazine to deliberately place, trying deliberately to use photographs exclusively and not other type of pictures because of the technical advances, was the Illustrated American in 1890. The Spanish-American War in Cuba was a kind of first big test of the new technique, of the new profession of the photo reporter. And if when we read descriptions of this period, we read also always about reporters, artists, as was called the illustrators, and the photo reporters going into the field. And I find I think that I would like to suggest maybe the first definition of the relations between the photo reporter or the artist and the journalism or the editor itself, as it was in the United States, was in the famous story about William Randolph Hearst and his morning journal. He sent his reporter to Richard Harding to Cuba, and with the artist or Frederick Remington, and at this time already his paper and other papers used the half-tone photographs that sometimes were really accurate portrayals of what was happening in Cuba, and the Cuban misery and the Spanish oppression, etc., etc. And sometimes they were simply fakes. And he sent Remington to send him some pictures that will prepare America to war. Remington cabled Hearst that there would be no war and that he's coming home. And then is this famous cable by Hearst, nobody knows it really was, but where he says, whereupon Hearst cables back and says, Remington, Havana, please remain. You will furnish the pictures, and I will furnish the war. And here I find it's the real separation, if you like, between the function of the editor, of the journalist who is giving contents, who is giving the meaning, and of the photo reporter or the artist who is supposed to give a kind of support, a kind of fake or truth to support this work. So we have here two functions going together, and the photo reporter is only helping. The second big step was, of course, when for instance, it was much more in Germany, much more before the 20s, with August Scher and Die Woche, which main purpose of this first illustrated magazine was no longer to illustrate the text, but to allow events to be seen directly in pictures and to render the world comprehensible through the photographs. The question is if those papers succeeded or not. And the answer is finally not. I will see at the second basic phrase or presentation of this function of the paper in the words of Life, first in the slogan of Life, to see life, to see the world, to witness the great events, to watch the faces of the poor and the questions of the period, to see strange things, which brings us to those publications who will publish strange things, but also things that will become dangerous, that will be pleasure to see, to astonish us, and to be, and the pictures that will bring us to be educated. So to do everything. And a little bit later, let's see about at the end of this first period, especially after the Second World War, we have a paper like it was mentioned, like the French Paris Match, who sees already that we cannot do everything with pictures like Life did, and the slogan with Paris Match will be "Le poids des mots, les chocs des photos." That's the weight of words and the shock of the photos. So from this point, we need words with the photos. The photos will give only this shocking part of the words. That's the reason maybe Paris Match exists until today and is including only 50% of photos, not almost the whole newspaper. And if we're speaking about objectivity, I just want to mention the research by our friend Barbie Zelitzer, who was an AP correspondent. Was an AP correspondent in Jerusalem. Then he did some researches in the 90s already on the journalism. She found, especially about the photography during the Spanish war in the 30s, the Spanish Civil War, and she found that journalists often convinced photojournalists to emphasize photographs as truthful, objective representations. The intent was to keep popular understanding of photographs in line with what the transparent objectivity of the text in news is generalized. And ironically, war photographs were hardly ever published alone. The images were almost always accompanied by text describing the scene in spite of photojournalist arguments. In some critiques that we can find about the concept of photojournalism, and I will finish with this critic that was finally an autocritic by the editor of Life, who is criticizing those papers who did not find the right way to manage between words and the journalistic text. I think I spare to you to do maybe two last phrases concerning the journals for high-level readers and for low-level readers. We can find the example of the French newspaper Le Monde. Was intended to well-educated and well-informed public who never had photographs. It was a policy of the newspaper until the 90s. It started only recently to have photographs. And we have the New York Daily News that I think doesn't exist anymore, who presented itself as a newspaper, as an illustrated newspaper until the end. And I maybe will add maybe as a last remark in those not very constructive I think remarks about the photojournalist, something that may be very provocative, maybe for photojournalists today. I think that today, in the situation of today, the paparazzi is maybe the last real photo reporter. Why? Because and the paparazzi is dealing, of course, with soft news, etc. But the paparazzi is the only one who could give us really the truth about to discover to us the Berlusconi orgies. Because of his powerful equipment, so he could see what nobody else could see. And if this technique is used, for instance, to show us some secret political meeting, so it can have also meaning that has its impact on hard news. Of course, the problem we also, if we hear, if we know what happens, etc. But due to the techniques, the still photography, which still can perform more than the video reporter, it's much more performant today, but it's a technical question. And in Europe, the profession of photo reporter is recognized since the French press law in 1935. Photo reporter is a reporter. There is a journalist, so they are called journalists. But today also, they're speaking already about journalists, preneurs d'images, etc. This kind of multifunction journalist, the cameraman who was once a full journalist, today is replaced by a journalist dealing also the other job. As you know, I was brought also during my professional career to do also this work of a photographer that I don't like very much. I'm not very skilled in, but if I was in a very dangerous place when I'm supposed to be a written journalist, so I just took my small camera with me. I tried to make some photos of what I saw. So from this point of view, there are very complicated relations that show that the two professions are linked, and they struggle together today about their future. Thank you very much.